It's 1865, and you're a Confederate soldier walking through the streets of Richmond. You reach it into your pocket and pull out what should be your month's pay, a crisp Confederate $20 bill. But when you try to buy a loaf of bread, the baker laughs at you. That'll be 92 Confederate dollars for the bread, he says. Or, if you happen to have any real money, any Union greenbacks, that'll be just $1. Your $20 bill? It's worth less than 25 cents in actual purchasing power. The money your government promised would be as good as gold has become worthless paper, and this financial collapse is about to lose the war for your side. Here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Civil War wasn't just won with bullets and bayonets, it was won with money. And the story of how the North's financial innovations crushed the South's economy is one of the most brilliant and ruthless economic warfare campaigns in human history. Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome back to My Money Mint, the channel where I dive into topics related to money and wealth. All right, let's get into it. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in 1861, America faced an unprecedented financial crisis. Just 1 year before the war, the entire United States had a national debt of only $65 million. But the cost of fighting the Civil War? Over $3.4 billion, making it the most expensive conflict in American history up to that point. To put this in perspective, the federal government went from having a surplus of $5.6 million before the war to running a deficit of $423 million by 1862. Both sides knew that whoever could solve the money problem would win the war. But here's where the story gets fascinating. The North and South chose completely different strategies, and those choices didn't just determine who won the war, they shaped the entire future of American finance. Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase had a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The Union needed massive amounts of money to field armies, buy weapons, and fund the war machine. But they were running out of gold to back their currency. So Chase did something that had never been tried before in American history. He convinced Congress to create money out of thin air. In February 1862, Congress passed the Legal Tender Act, authorizing the creation of $150 million in greenbacks, paper money that wasn't backed by gold or silver, but simply by the government's promise that it had value. This was revolutionary. Think about it. For the first time since the American Revolution, the federal government was printing money not backed by precious metals. They were essentially betting the entire war effort on people's faith in the US government. The debate in Congress was fierce. Politicians warned that printing unbacked paper money was the most dangerous road to financial ruin. They remembered what happened during the Revolutionary War when continental currency became so worthless that not worth a continental became a common saying. But Chase and Lincoln knew they had no choice. The army needed to pay suppliers and soldiers without delay. By the end of the war, $450 million worth of greenbacks were circulating throughout the North. And here's the brilliant part. Despite causing some inflation, prices rose about 14% in 1862 and 25% in 1863 and 1864. The greenbacks worked. They funded about 15% of the entire war effort and gave the North the financial flexibility to mobilize industry on an unprecedented scale. But Lincoln and Chase weren't done innovating. In 1863, they pulled off an even more sophisticated financial maneuver with the National Bank Act. Here's how genius this system was. Instead of just asking banks to loan money to the government, they forced banks to become investors in the war effort. Any bank that wanted to become a national bank had to buy US government bonds equal to 1/3 of their capital. So if you had a $1 million bank, you had to purchase $333,000 in government war bonds. But here's the clever part. Once you bought those bonds, the government would let you print your own money, up to $500,000 in national banknotes, backed by the bonds you just purchased. Think about what this accomplished. Banks were essentially forced to loan money to the government to get the right to create currency. Millions of dollars flowed into the Treasury through this system, creating a captive market for war bonds while giving banks a profitable way to participate. This was financial engineering on a level that had never been attempted before. The Union had created a system where funding the war effort was not just patriotic, it was profitable. Meanwhile, the Confederacy was making financial decisions that would doom them from the start. The South had a fundamental problem. They believed so strongly in states' rights that they refused to give their central government the power to collect taxes effectively. While the North was raising about 20% of their war revenue through direct taxation, the South could only manage about 8%. Most Southern states simply refused to collect federal taxes, instead paying their quotas by borrowing money or printing more money. Between 1862 and 1865, more than 60% of all Confederate revenue came from one source, printing money. While the North doubled their money supply during the war, the Confederacy increased theirs by 20 times. They went from having a functioning currency to printing money like a modern-day hyperinflation disaster. The results were catastrophic. At the beginning of the war, a Confederate dollar was worth about 90 cents in gold. By the war's end, one Confederate dollar was worth 1.7 cents. A price index that started at 100 in 1861 had risen to over 9,200 by April 1865. That means something that cost $1 in 1861 cost $92 in Confederate money by the war's end. Imagine trying to run a war when your soldiers' pay becomes worthless month by month, when suppliers won't accept your currency, and when even your own citizens lose faith in your money. But the South's monetary problems weren't just caused by their own incompetence. They were under attack from one of the most successful financial warfare operations in history. Meet Samuel Curtis Upham, a Philadelphia shopkeeper who became the Confederacy's worst nightmare. In February 1862, Upham spotted something interesting in the Philadelphia Inquirer, a detailed reproduction of a Confederate $5 bill that the newspaper had printed to show readers what enemy money looked like. Upham had a brilliant idea. He contacted the reporter, bought the printing plate, and started producing his own copies of Confederate money. At first, he marketed them as souvenirs, printing facsimile Confederate note, sold wholesale and retail by S. Ada C. Upham, 403 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia, at the bottom of each bill. He sold his first batch of 3,000 fake $5 bills for a penny each. They sold out in days. But here's where it gets devious. Cotton smugglers operating across enemy lines quickly realized that Upham's souvenirs were just a scissor cut away from being perfect counterfeits. They bought thousands of Upham's bills, trimmed off the facsimile notice, and used them to buy cotton from Southern planters. Those fake bills then circulated throughout the Confederate economy as real money. Upham quickly realized what was happening, and he embraced it. He started advertising nationally in Harper's Weekly and the New York Tribune, promoting his bills as mementos of the rebellion. He even offered to pay 3 times the value in gold for samples of other Confederate denominations so he could counterfeit those too. Within 90 days, Upham's small stationery shop had become a full-scale counterfeiting operation. In April 1862 alone, he sold 80,000 fake Confederate bills. The Confederate government quickly realized they were under attack. Jefferson Davis himself placed a $10,000 bounty on Upham's head, dead or alive. Henry Foote, speaking before the Confederate Congress, declared that Upham had done more damage to the Confederacy than the whole Union Army. And he might have been right. By the time Upham shut down his operation in August 1863, he claimed to have printed 1.56 million fake Confederate notes with a face value of $15 million. Economic historians estimate that Upham's counterfeits represented between 1% and 2.8% of all Confederate money in circulation during his active period. One man with a printing press had created nearly 3% of an entire nation's money supply. And it was all fake. Here's the most incredible part. The Union government couldn't legally stop Upham even if they wanted to. Why? Because the United States didn't recognize the Confederate States as a legitimate nation. Since the CSA didn't legally exist, counterfeiting their money wasn't technically a crime under U.S. law. When authorities investigated Upham for potential counterfeiting, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton personally dismissed the case. Some historians even suspect that Stanton might have secretly provided Upham with high-quality banknote paper to improve his counterfeits and maximize damage to the Confederate economy. By 1863, the Confederate economy was in free fall. Confederate soldiers were being paid in money that lost value faster than they could spend it. In Richmond, a barrel of flour cost 1,000 Confederate dollars. A pound of tea? $35. Basic necessities became impossible to afford for ordinary citizens. But here's what made it even worse. The Confederacy couldn't print high-quality money because they lacked the sophisticated printing equipment that remained in the North. Their currency was crude and easy to counterfeit. Criminals throughout the North began copying Upham's business model. Counterfeit Confederate money became so common that people joked fake bills were often higher quality than the real ones. Meanwhile, the situation became so desperate that 40 of Louisiana's 48 parishes started printing their own money. Towns across the South, from Shreveport to Baton Rouge, all began issuing local currency because national Confederate bills were too scarce or too worthless to use. Even private businesses got in on the act. Saddlers, railroads, and insurance companies all started printing money substitutes to keep commerce flowing. The Confederate monetary system had completely collapsed into chaos. While the South was printing worthless paper, the North was building the foundation of modern American finance. The greenback system proved so successful that it gave the Union the ability to quickly increase their money supply without relying on limited gold reserves. This financial flexibility proved vital not just during the Civil War, but during World War I and beyond. The National Banking Acts created the dual federal-state banking structure that still defines the American financial system today. Every time you walk into a bank that's regulated by both state and federal authorities, you're seeing the legacy of Civil War financial innovation. And here's something most people don't know. The Civil War also gave birth to America's first income tax. In July 1861, Congress imposed a 3% tax on all incomes over $800, rising to 10% for incomes over $100,000. This combination of innovations, fiat currency, national banking, and income taxation, created the template for modern American fiscal policy. The financial war extended far beyond America's borders. Union bonds became a global commodity, with massive sales to investors in England, France, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Russia, Austria, Ireland, Italy, and the Netherlands. Even Cuban planters, despite their own slave-owning practices, invested heavily in Union bonds because they were seen as safer than Confederate securities. By the end of the war, international investors had purchased at least $400 million in Union bonds. By the Reconstruction period, nearly half of all U.S. debt was owned abroad, making American securities a truly global investment. This international confidence in Union financial management contrasted sharply with the Confederacy's failed attempts to raise money overseas. The South managed to raise only about £3 million through an 1862 bond sale to the Orleans Bank in Paris. And most of that money was wasted on ships that were never delivered due to the Union blockade. The Civil War proved that in modern warfare, the side that can innovate financially often determines the victor. The Union's superior financial system gave them decisive advantages that went far beyond just having more money. While Confederate money became worthless, Union greenbacks maintained enough value to fund the war machine and keep the economy functioning. The national banking system created a captive market for government bonds, ensuring steady war financing throughout the conflict. The Union's financial innovations allowed them to vastly increase federal government influence and mobilize industry on an unprecedented scale. The unified banking system gave the North better access to both domestic and international capital markets. Through counterfeiting operations and monetary policy, the North actively undermined Confederate financial stability. Meanwhile, the South's refusal to grant taxing power to their central government, based on their commitment to states' rights, crippled there to fund the war through conventional means. Governor Moore of Alabama captured the Confederate dilemma perfectly when he complained that collecting federal taxes imposes upon the state the necessity of enforcing the laws of the Confederate government, something many Southern states were ideologically opposed to doing. But behind all these financial innovations and economic warfare tactics were real people suffering real consequences. Confederate soldiers watched their pay become worthless month by month. A private who earned $20 per month in 1861 found that same $20 could barely buy a loaf of bread by 1864. Families saw their savings evaporate as Confederate currency collapsed. People who had worked their entire lives to accumulate wealth discovered that their money had become worthless paper. The wealthy could protect themselves by converting to gold or Union currency, but ordinary citizens, especially in rural areas, had no choice but to watch their purchasing power disappear. This is the human reality of currency warfare. When governments use money as a weapon, innocent people always pay the price. The financial innovations developed during the Civil War didn't just win the war, they transformed America into a modern economic superpower. The greenback system established the precedent for fiat currency that would eventually lead to the complete abandonment of the gold standard in 1971. The National Banking Acts created the foundation for America's current banking system and established the principle that the federal government could regulate financial institutions. The successful use of war bonds demonstrated that the U.S. government could tap both domestic and international capital markets to fund massive expenditures, and the income tax, originally intended as a temporary war measure, became a permanent feature of American fiscal policy. Perhaps most importantly, the Civil War established the principle that financial warfare could be just as effective as military warfare. The Union's systematic destruction of Confederate monetary credibility became a template for economic warfare that would be used in conflicts throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The financial lessons of the Civil War remain strikingly relevant today. When governments print money to fund massive expenditures, inflation inevitably follows. When monetary systems lose credibility, economic chaos results. The Union's success in maintaining international confidence while financing an enormous war effort offers lessons for modern deficit spending and debt management. The Confederacy's failure to establish effective taxation demonstrates the importance of fiscal capacity in sustaining government operations during crises. Here's the truth most Americans never learn. The Civil War was won as much in the counting houses of Philadelphia and New York as it was on the battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam. While generals fought with armies, financiers fought with ledgers, printing presses, and bond sales. The Union's financial innovations, greenbacks, national banks, income taxes, and international bond markets, created an economic war machine that the agricultural, state rights-obsessed Confederacy simply couldn't match. The South lost the war the moment they chose to finance their rebellion by printing money instead of building sustainable fiscal institutions. Every Confederate dollar that rolled off the printing presses was another nail in their coffin. Meanwhile, every Union greenback, every national bank bond, and every counterfeit Confederate bill created by Samuel Upham was a weapon in a financial war that would determine the fate of the nation. The Civil War financial innovations didn't just win one conflict, they established the foundation for American financial dominance that would last for the next century and a half. The principles developed during those 4 bloody years, fiat currency, federal banking regulation, income taxation, and international bond markets became the cornerstones of American economic policy. When America needed to finance World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, they used updated versions of the same financial tools first developed to defeat the Confederacy. The Union's victory proved that, in the modern world, economic power and military power are inseparable. You can't sustain armies without sustainable finances, and you can't maintain sovereignty without monetary credibility. This is why the Civil War remains the most important financial conflict in American history. It wasn't just a war between North and South. It was a war between 2 completely different visions of how money and government should work. The North bet on federal power, fiat currency, and financial innovation. The South bet on state autonomy, hard money orthodoxy, and agricultural economics. History shows which vision won, and the financial innovations that emerged from that victory continue to shape American power today. Every time you use a Federal Reserve note, you're using the descendant of a Civil War greenback. Every time you pay income taxes, you're participating in a system first created to fund Union armies. Every time you walk into a nationally chartered bank, you're entering an institution created by Civil War financial legislation. The monetary system that Abraham Lincoln and Salmon Chase built to win the Civil War became the foundation for American financial supremacy that would dominate the global economy for the next 160 years. But that system is now under threat from the same kinds of forces that destroyed Confederate currency: excessive money printing, loss of international confidence, and the rise of alternative monetary systems. The North won the Civil War by innovating financially while maintaining monetary credibility. The South lost by printing money without building sustainable fiscal institutions. Which path is America choosing now? Thank you for watching my Money Minute.